So Dr. Will Norman from the Young Foundation actually was commissioned and is the author of the Move It campaign, which Nike asked him to do, about young people's participation in sport and their attitudes to it. And this is relevant to everybody here, because if these people are not your clients now, they're going to be your clients in the next 10, 20 years, or maybe they won't be. Isn't that the point? That if they're not interested in sport now, when will they be? So Will, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. I'm in a really awkward position here. There are 400 active, fit health professionals, and I'm the single barrier for stopping them getting their lunch at the moment. So I'm going to keep this short and sweet. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I love the new rebrand, and I think the work that the new UK Active is going to make a huge difference for this sector in the future. I want to say a quick thing about who I work for. I work for an organization called the Young Foundation. We're named after a guy called Michael Young, rather than exclusively working with young people. But we do research into social needs and issues that affect communities across the UK and come up with solutions to some of those problems. For the past 18 months, as John said, we've been working with Nike, looking at issues around physical activity in the UK, and particularly focusing on young people and how we can drive change, how we can get more young people active. This is not a problem that is unique to the UK. This is a global problem. We're facing a massive slowdown. Physical activity is being engineered out of our lifestyles. We're seeing a huge drop over the last in less than 2 generations in the UK, we've seen a fall of over 20% of physical activity. And by 2035, this is going to fall it's going to fall again by another 35%. This is a serious problem that is being shared by countries across the world. So this has to be part of a global movement. We can work in a local context, but a lot of these problems are shared by countries across the world. And we've talked a lot about the massive cost of some of the problems. As we've heard earlier, the cost of the NHS of physical activity on an annual basis is £1.8 billion, and it's increasing. The Chief Medical Officer estimated that the full cost to the UK economy is about £8 billion. Well, actually, more independent research that's being published in the next couple of months shows that it's actually closer to $30 billion a year. That's closer to 20 billion. It's around 20 billion pounds a year. This is massive impact, not to mention the personal costs in terms of people's lives and the impact. And the impact of chronic diseases and a lot of just the human suffering that is incurred by not having a physically active population. And the trend is going to get worse. We need to change this. We need to get the UK active again. We need a fundamental change in the way that it's working. The current approach is not working. Participation rates in sports are falling across the board, and we need to reverse that now. And our report, which I can hold up here, and is readily downloadable on our website, is a first step on how we think that some of the first steps that we can do to get the UK moving again. And I think this is the most important part of our work, is that this has to be a youth-centered policy. This is not just about providing things and activities to young people. It has to be youth-centered. It has to be co-designed with young people. We have to listen to what young people want to be doing in the spaces where they want to be doing it, in the manner and style and general ethos in which they want to do it. This, of course, starts at schools. Somebody mentioned the 18-year-old the 18-month-old ballet dancer. I think this starts at schools and goes down to the early years provision. Working with parents at an early age is vitally important to driving this change. But as this quote said, this policy can't be designed by adults. Actually understanding and listening to what young people want to be doing is vitally important. And as part of the work that we've been doing, it's actually been hanging out and listening to what young people want to be doing within this space. And what we saw was that the competitive sports, the approach and the focus that government has had on competitive sports works for some people, but it does not work for all people. What we've seen, and it came up in a couple of questions earlier on today, was that focusing on competitive sports can get active people doing other activities. As somebody said earlier on, you have to focus on the inactive. We have to come up with approaches that focus on the most inactive people in our populations. And that involves listening to them, hearing what they want to do, and making sure that these activities are easy to do and sit within those communities. When we spent time with young people listening to what they want to be doing and the activities they're doing, they were coming up with flexible and informal type activities, things that can be done not in uniform and not in sports, but in all sorts of different spaces, in casual clothes, with all sorts of music playing, that essentially are fun. You know, making these things fun is vital. The rise of taking note of fashionable sports, the rise of Zumba, the rise of parkour. Some of these I'd never heard of before I started doing this research, but parkour is all the sort of around street free jumping and using the urban environment as a mechanism for driving sport. And then using digital to actually enhance this. The number of young people who were doing some incredible stuff, jumping off things safely, I have to add, the skateboarding, the BMXing, and then recording this on their phones and sharing it as a platform, as a mechanism of driving the sort of look what I can do, the status that's associated with some of this. We can tap into that energy. We can tap into that digital platform in a far better way. So making the most of sharing that stuff through the peer networking, the social networks, I think are really fundamentally important. And then the other thing, I suppose, is that digital platforms are often seen as the bad side of this. People are sitting down playing video games and watching sports rather than participating. Can we think more creatively about working with the video game industry to actually say, well, you've been playing these games, look at the role that FIFA Championship Manager plays or some of the football games. How can we link some of the activities that young people are actively doing, investing huge amounts of time in, to try and convert that into physical activities? So I really welcome Anne's discussion earlier, just saying that this is not just about about competitive sports. This is about making sure that there are different courses for different horses and that we are targeting the most inactive. I want to touch on another couple of points, and this one was one that shocked me. Again, this research is all about being shocked. I think if you're not doing anything that's shocking or doesn't shock you personally and surprise you, then you need to get another job. And this really sort of shocked me. The way that sport is delivered, somebody described this as a plate of spaghetti before we turned it into a slightly sharper looking PowerPoint. But it was all the different agencies, all the different institutions, and the links between them are hopelessly confusing. A previous Secretary of State described this structure as a complete nightmare. She did not understand how sport was being delivered within this country. And I think what we're looking for here is systemic change. We need change that embraces both government and policy, but also brings in business, that small business as well as big business. It brings in the voluntary and community sector, and it's driven at a local basis. I very much welcomed the approach that Andy set out in writing to Jeremy Hunt to invite a more cross-party, more cross-departmental approach of strategy, and I hope that comes out. But I'm slightly cynical that cross-party, cross-departmental words, everybody always says it needs to be cross-departmental, it needs to be cross-party. It's much harder to achieve that in practice. So I think the hope is in the local areas, where you've got networks of these local actors coming together, local businesses coming saying, well, this is what I can offer, and being driven by personalities and by real people, providing the right services in the right context for those communities so that we can actually affect change happening in a local area. And schools are really important parts of that. We should see schools way beyond a mechanism for delivering education. They're important hubs within the community. My wife is a teacher, and she hates me every time I said, oh, there should be more emphasis on schools. She's saying, well, we're teaching, we're busy, we're doing enough, you know. But actually, the facilities that are available in schools, the school is a meeting point. It engages the whole of local communities. That, linking those to the activities within the external community, making partnerships between the schools and local businesses, are a really key way of actually driving this change forward in everyday lives. Money. It's never far from the picture, and I think you can't talk about any area of local policy at the moment, or policy in general, without thinking about the cuts. And I wanted to echo one of the points that was made earlier, that the local government provide the biggest investment in leisure and sports facilities, estimated well over £1.5 billion. But that is not statutory and it's not ring-fenced, and therefore it is going to get cut. And so we do need to be thinking about aligning all the different investments that are going on. That comes back to the idea of, well, what's going on in health, what's going on in education, what's happening with the sports and leisure facilities. But I also think that, if I skip back a bit, that the way that sports are delivered, and particularly sports are being delivered locally, acts as a significant barrier for a range of other players to become involved in this. As part of the work that we were doing, we spoke to a lot of businesses, both small and big, not necessarily associated with sports and leisure, but they were interested in not sponsoring the clubs. They were interested in sponsoring the grassroots levels, but they had no idea how to penetrate the system, who to talk to in terms of making this happen. So what they were doing, instead of feeding into longer-term strategic programs that would achieve change, they were sponsoring one-off events that were happening in communities and single things, which were great. But that money could be aligned far better if there was a strategic approach. And I hope that with the shift of power going towards local areas and with the public health agenda, that could provide an avenue for different players to become involved in this. Making the most of informal resources. Somebody touched on volunteering earlier, and John said that this year had been the year for volunteering. Volunteers play such an important part in this. They save so much money. They provide so much energy and drive that change. We can continue to use those volunteers, and I think that as you drive for more local change, there's more ownership in bringing in other people to be those volunteers, getting rid of some of the regulatory barriers that are part of that are really important, both in terms of one of the examples I came up with, another shocking thing, was that there are tax burdens on voluntary sports organizations in this country that is going against European best practice. Surely, if we're taking seriously the need to drive change at a local level, let's remove some of those tax burdens on those organizations. And finally, I think this is very important, building the business case for investment in physical activity. Building the business case, coming up with the data, having the facts to hand, can then initiate all sorts of other types of investment. Somebody was talking about preventative investment earlier on. I was talking to a group of people who are trying to do a sports impact bond, where you put up money and the savings that are saved by some of the through some of the activities are then returned to those investors. Having the data, having the information, having the evidence base allows more creative ways of funding to emerge to the fore. But I think that this is another area where I'm particularly worried, is that data tracking. As a researcher, I'd always say, yep, we need good data. But without good data, we can't realize the preventative investments or the potential that a lot of these new emissions have. And what we're seeing is that certain surveys, the school sports survey and other things, are beginning to get cut within the framework. So without the data, we're not going to be able to make the business case, and it's going to be much harder to leverage funding and new types of funding in the future. So I have a plea to policymakers and people in central government: keep tracking this data. If we don't track the data, we don't know what's working. If we don't know what's working, we will waste money. It just seems to me as common sense. We can experiment, we need new innovations, but unless we keep a monitor on what impact this is having on people, then it's very difficult to channel more investment or to change things as we go. I'm going to wrap up, and just to say that this piece of work is the beginning of something. This is work. We started off working directly with Nike on this piece of work, but it's just a start. But the way we see this going forward in the future is as a movement. This is about driving systemic change in different societies around the world. There will be different local contexts within that change, but I think what we need to do is build a coalition of the willing, to use that ghastly phrase, and bring together the different actors from government, from the voluntary sector, from business, from communities, to actually make a significant change on how this goes forward. And we ourselves will be looking at local pilots where some of these networks are working, seeing what's the recipe of success in local areas, and then trying to publicize that and broadcast that out so that other people can adopt some of those lessons from learning. So I don't want to stand in the way of your lunch anymore, and I'll say a big thank you.
minutes, we can have a couple of questions. I don't know if you can flick your thing and just go back to the drop-off in participation, though, which was the first one you showed. I mean, without being silly, when you look at figures like that, you know, 46%, I mean, you're saying half the population in China, and that's a lot of people.
That's not half the population, that's half the amount of activity.
Oh, okay.
So it's, again, still massive.
It's still massive. Figures like that, are they not irreparable? Or if they're not, what are the first things that need to be done?
They can't be irreparable. If we carry on like this, it's unaffordable, and it's going to be a disaster for society, for our economies and everything else. It has to happen now. We have to start with a new generation. If we can track the data, we know when drop-off points occur over people's life course. Yeah? Let's target those drop-off points. Let's invest early. Yeah? Let's work with schools. Let's work with early years centre, and then look at where the drop-off points in people's life are. There's a big drop-off point from the shift and the transition from primary school to secondary school. There's a big drop-off point, and it's slightly different between boys and girls, around adolescence. There's another drop-off point leaving education. There's another drop-off point in entering the workforce. There's another drop-off point in parenting kicks in. There's another drop-off point when work finishes. Yeah? Let's think about this strategically. And across these different countries, I don't think it is irreparable. It can't be, you know, for the sake of our children, friends,
and mankind, and our children's children.
This sounds rather grand. I'm not doing but it can't be irreparable. It is fixable. We need to invest early, and then we need to look at the drop-off points.
Okay, just a couple of questions that we will have for lunch. So, gentleman there, lady there, then we're done. So, yeah, gentleman with his sunglasses on.
Well, it's a little bit too bright.
You should stand here.
Nathan Haig from Australia, wow. I actually represent around about 5,000 personal trainers and fitness instructors in the UK and about 30,000 instructors around the world. And the joined-up thinking that we've been talking about today with you know, the data tracking as well, how do you propose to do that with the guys at the coalface, like the personal trainers? How do you want to record that data? How will you get it in? Where to? I find the compliance over in the UK and the health and safety just baffling. I really do. Like, how do you then work with these kids? How do you tap in? You had the slide up there about how to tap in to obviously government funding, etc. How does a personal trainer, like with a company of other personal trainers, tap into all this? The people at the coal face.
I think the key thing is keep it simple and make it work for you. Learn from what other people are doing. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff going on in the sector in terms of measurement and impact measurement. Be worth talking to. There's the Value of Sports Monitor. The Laureus Sports for Good have got a sort of a more global program. But I think technology is actually really helpful here. I think that I've been noticing, I've started looking at people's shoes in this room, and there are quite a lot of people with little gadgets tapped to their shoes, which presumably counts the amount of physical activity that can be done. I've got something on my wrist that is beginning to do that. And that can be very easily shared on the internet. That doesn't actually take anything other than me remembering to plug this in every couple of days that uploads the amount of physical activity that I've been doing.
Which is fine, but then how do you correlate that across the whole country into some meaningful and tangible results other than disjointed Nike, disjointed Puma, disjointed, etc.? How do you correlate all that information into a central spot?
And the point, sorry, and picking up on that, you know, if let's just say, when people go to the work, when people start getting employed at 21, 22, they leave university, they leave college of education, and there's a huge fall off because suddenly their work time, leisure, lifestyle is completely skewed. If it's obvious that that's an area of a massive dropout, whose responsibility is it to actually target that group of people, and how do you go about having a coordinated approach to it?
So coming back, just on wrapping up on the data point, I think that these things will evolve. I think we're in an early stage of some of this, and on the technology side, we begin to be able to see databases beginning to come together, and I hope that will be continue to do. And I can come back, maybe have a good discussion at lunchtime on that. I think the drop-off point is really important and interesting. Who takes ownership? Because transitions are you're in limbo, aren't you? You're moving from one sector to another. I think preparing for those transitions is really important. If you actually spend time with some of the young people who are active in schools, they're maybe they're part of a football team, they might be the captain and what have you. How are they then? I think there's a responsibility within the schools to be thinking about giving the leadership to those, the leadership skills for those young people to think, well, If we want to carry on going to playing our game of football as friends in this area, well, how do we go about booking up a five-a-side court? Yeah? Where do we start going to be able to do some of these activities outside of school? Because when you speak to some of the young people, they're saying, well, I used to do this at school and it was all provided for me. How do we ramp up the personal responsibility and expose people to, well, this is how you can continue some of those activities outside of the school context?
That's a really interesting point as well. Okay, last point before lunch. Lady there.
Hi, I'm Deborah Richardson. I'm an independent consultant in public health and physical activity. And I'm extremely interested in your suggestion about the need to track data more. A lot of the work I've done recently, and certainly I used to work with the Department of Health, I work with the National Obesity Observatory, is around evaluation frameworks for physical activity. And one of the things working with Sport England recently was reviewing the impact of sports programmes on inactivity.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that stands out is that we now have this shift and rebranding of the FIA to ukactive, which I really welcome. But along with that, we almost need a shift change in our perception of what needs to be evaluated and how we measure impact and outcome. Yeah. Because if we're looking at trying to measure impact of changes in levels of activity in order to influence and impact public health, we need to start measuring initial baseline levels of activity and working those through. Traditionally, sports programs, as everybody's aware here, measure the requirements as laid out by Sport England, which typically have been those new to sport and those who increase participation in sport. Yeah. So we almost need to have a reframing of our thinking in terms of, we are talking now about activity, we are talking about the impacts on public health. In order to do that, we need to make sure we've got the appropriate measures in place to be able to show that shift and change. And I kind of just welcome your thoughts on that.
My initial thoughts, I couldn't agree more. I think that we are, as I mentioned earlier, this is about a systems change. This is a whole systemic change that needs to happen with society. That starts with rethinking what the problem is. And I think up for a long time, the problem, how do we get people to do these sports? How do we get people to play football? How do we get people to do this? How do we get people to do that? Rather than thinking, how do we get people just to be active? How do we engineer that in lives? And I think you're right, that does require different metrics, different measurements, different ways of thinking, and different actors in this field. We need to bring in other people. But I'm not going to give you my whole diatribe on measuring and metrics right now, because lunch is waiting.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask the last question, though, following on from that, saying, so if this has to be done, yeah, who has to lead it? Does the central government lead it? Does local government lead it? Or do the people in this room lead it?
That, I think, is a very interesting question. I think that there isn't going to be a single leader in providing this. There needs to be leadership that's exposed within different sectors, and there needs to be a forum that allows that for those different sectors to come together. And I'm not sure which forum will be best for that, but rather than just to say somebody else should do that, we are working with Nike at the moment to try and design something that maybe can sort of start that discussion. But I think we need leadership from business. We need leadership from small business, local authorities, charities, and some of the existing sports infrastructure to come together on this to discuss that.
Is that a Nike fuel band you've got on your...
It is, and it was free. So,
it's free, well, it's because I've got one, but I can't work it.
Oh, I'm addicted to mine. I must
talk to you about it at lunchtime, okay. Listen, you've mentioned lunch several times, so obviously desperately hungry. So can I just... at 1:30, we resume in 3 breakout groups, and it's entirely up to you where you go and what you do. Come back in here if you want to talk about digital technology. Go to the Congress suite over there if you want to talk about public health. If you want to talk about employer ownership fund, you go upstairs to the 2nd floor. Come back at 1:30. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much for the morning.